All right, so you know how in India there's always this kind of like push and pull going on between the states and, well, the central government, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's like a constant balancing act, isn't it?
Exactly. And just recently, the Supreme Court weighed in on one of these kind of like power struggles with a pretty major clarification.
Oh, yeah. This is the one with Tamil Nadu and their governor, right?
That's the one. And it really gets to the heart of how much authority a governor actually has when it comes to laws passed by the state.
I bet this is going to be super relevant for all those UPSC folks out there.
Big time. If you're trying to wrap your head around Indian federalism and how all the pieces fit together, well, this case is like a crash course.
So are we diving into like the whole Supreme Court judgment today?
We are, but don't worry, we're not going to drown you in legal jargon. We've been poring over this analysis in the Indian Express to pull out the most important bits.
Yeah, and we'll connect it back to the actual Constitution too, so it all makes sense, you know?
Exactly. We're aiming for that sweet spot where you get the what happened, why it matters, and the bigger picture stuff, all without like a law degree.
Perfect. So where do we even begin with this whole Tamil Nadu situation?
Let's start with the spark that ignited this whole thing. What was the core issue that set everything off?
Well, basically, you had the Tamil Nadu governor hitting the brakes on 10 bills.
10. Wow.
Yeah, 10 bills that had already been passed by the state legislature. He was withholding his assent, which is like the governor's official stamp of approval.
Right. And that power to withhold assent that comes straight from Article 200 of the Constitution.
Exactly. But the Tamil Nadu government, they weren't having it. They took the case to the Supreme Court, arguing that the governor was basically overstepping his boundaries.
So they felt like their ability to actually govern was being undermined.
Exactly. And, you know, the Tamil Nadu Assembly, they didn't just sit back and take it. They actually went ahead and repassed those same bills.
Oh, wow. So they doubled down. What did the governor do then?
Okay, so instead of giving his assent like the Assembly wanted or sending those bills back with specific reasons why he wasn't happy with them, the governor did something else. He decided to refer those reenacted bills to the president.
Oh, so he kicked it up the ladder?
Yep, straight to the president's desk for consideration, and that's where the Supreme Court stepped in and said, hold on a sec, that move right there, referring those repassed bills, that wasn't kosher. They said it was erroneous in law.
So the Supreme Court was basically saying the governor was exceeding his authority.
Yeah, they were drawing a line in the sand about what a governor can and cannot do, especially when the elected legislature has very clearly stated their will. You know.
This is getting interesting. So let's break down that Supreme Court verdict piece by piece. What were the absolute must-know highlights, the main pillars of their ruling?
Okay, so first off, the Supreme Court was crystal clear that the governor sending those reenacted bills to the president. Not cool. They flat out said that governors don't have what they called an absolute veto or a pocket veto under Article 200.
So no more sweeping things under the rug and hoping they just go away.
Nope. This is huge for anyone trying to understand the dynamics between the center and the states, because it means a governor can't just let a bill sit there forever without any consequences.
Gotcha. So no more stalling tactics. What else did the court really hit hard on?
They went out of their way to emphasize that governors are bound by the advice of the Council of Ministers.
Right. That's like a fundamental principle of our parliamentary system.
It is, but the Supreme Court went out of their way to reiterate it in this specific context. They were basically saying, look, governors, you're not rogue agents. You're supposed to work within the framework of the elected government.
Okay. So they're putting their foot down about staying in their lane. What about those bills that got sent back and then passed again by the Assembly?
The Supreme Court was super clear on that, too. Once a bill has gone through that whole back and forth and comes back to the governor after being repassed, they have to give their assent.
So no second chances to just kill the same bill?
Not really, unless the bill got so drastically changed during that reconsultation that it's practically a brand new piece of legislation.
Interesting. And didn't the Supreme Court actually set some specific deadlines for governors to act?
They did. To avoid any more of this endless waiting game, the Supreme Court laid down some very specific timelines. When a bill first lands on the governor's desk, they've got 1 month to do something.
So grant assent, withhold assent, or send it back for another look.
Exactly. And they even gave a rough guideline of about 3 months if the governor wants to go against what the state cabinet is recommending.
Interesting. So it's not a completely free-for-all anymore.
Not at all. And for those bills that bounce back after being reconsidered and passed again by the Assembly, 1 month again for the governor to give their assent.
So they're really tightening things up to make the whole process more efficient.
Yeah. No more leaving bills in limbo. For UPSC folks listening, these timelines are key because they show how the Supreme Court is trying to set clear boundaries for how governors operate.
Makes sense. So zooming out a bit, what's the big picture impact of all of this?
Yeah.
How do you think this is going to affect the relationship between states and governors going forward?
Well, the biggest thing is it really limits how much a governor can interfere with what a state legislature wants to do.
So less potential for obstructionism.
Exactly. This ruling really reinforces the idea that governors are supposed to be more like constitutional figureheads, you know?
They're there to uphold the system, not to push their own political agenda.
Right. They're expected to act on the advice of the government that was actually elected by the people. And it also emphasizes that at the end of the day, it's the state legislature that has the primary power to make laws for their state.
So it's about respecting that division of powers.
Exactly. And it acts as a check on any potential overreach from the governor's office. You know, this isn't just some abstract legal debate. This has real-world consequences for how our democracy functions.
Right. And you mentioned this has implications for other states too, right?
For sure. We've seen similar situations play out in places like Kerala, West Bengal, Telangana, Punjab, where governors have really dragged their feet on giving assent to bills.
So this ruling sets a precedent for them too.
Absolutely. It provides a clear legal framework for how to handle these kinds of standoffs in the future. And for anyone studying for those UPSC exams, this is a prime example of how the Supreme Court is constantly shaping and refining our understanding of how power is distributed within our federal structure.
It's like a living, breathing system always evolving.
Exactly. Okay, so now that we've got a good grasp on this particular case, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. What are all the things a governor can actually do when it comes to state bills? I mean, we've talked a lot about Article 200, but what's the full menu of options?
Yeah, let's lay it all out.
Okay, so under Article 200, a governor has 4 main moves they can make when a bill passed by the state legislature lands on their desk.
All right, option number 1.
Grant assent. That's the most straightforward one. The bill becomes law boom, done.
Easy peasy. Option number 2.
Withhold assent. That's essentially like a veto at the state level.
Right, but the Supreme Court just put some pretty big limits on that power.
They did. Option number 3 is they can send the bill back to the legislature for reconsideration.
It's basically saying, hey, take another look at this, maybe tweak some things.
Exactly. And the last option is reserving the bill for the president's consideration.
Okay, that one sounds a little more serious.
It is. This is usually when the governor thinks the bill might clash with a central law or deals with something super important at the national level.
It's like escalating it to the next level. And what happens when a bill gets sent all the way up to the president?
Well, that's where Article 201 comes in. The ball is in the president's court now. They can either give their assent, making it officially law, or withhold assent, which basically kills the bill.
So it's the president's call at that point.
Yep. And there's a special process for non-money bills. If the president decides to veto a non-money bill, they can also tell the governor to send it back to the state legislature for another round of discussions.
So the legislature gets another crack at it.
Right. They have 6 months to reconsider things. And even if they pass the bill again without changing anything, it's got to go back to the president for the final say-so.
So ultimately, the central government has the upper hand in certain situations.
Definitely. For UPSC folks, this whole flow of power between the state legislature, the governor, and the president is crucial for understanding how federalism works in practice.
It's like a delicate dance.
Oh.
And we've also got Article 207 in the mix, right?
Oh, yeah. Good catch. Article 207 is all about money bills. It says that a money bill can't even be introduced in the state assembly without the governor's okay.
So the governor has some influence, even at the very beginning of the process, for financial bills.
Yep. And just to add another layer here, we've got the Supreme Court's take on all of this from the Rameshwar Prasad case back in 2006.
Oh, right. What was that about again?
Well, the court basically said that a governor's power to withhold assent isn't a blank check.
They can't just use it however they want.
Nope. The court said that if a governor's decision seems arbitrary or like they're acting in bad faith, or if it's just completely unreasonable, then it can be challenged in court.
So there are checks and balances even on the governor's discretionary powers.
Absolutely. It's all about making sure everyone stays within the lines of the Constitution.
Okay, so all of that is like the official rule book.
Yeah.
But we know that in reality, there have been a lot of concerns about how governors actually behave, right?
Huh.
It feels like there's often some underlying political drama going on.
Oh, for sure. I mean, one of the biggest worries has always been about whether governors are truly impartial. There's this nagging feeling that sometimes they act more like representatives of the central government, especially the party in power, than as neutral figures.
Yeah, like they're carrying out orders from the top instead of upholding the Constitution.
Right. And then you have cases like the one in Arunachal Pradesh back in 2016. The governor's actions there actually led to the elected state government getting dismissed.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a huge controversy. And the Supreme Court ended up overturning the decision, but it definitely left a bad taste in people's mouths.
So it raises serious questions about whether governors are really playing by the rules.
Exactly. For UPSC students, these case studies are gold because they show how maintaining that balance within our federal system can be super tricky in the real world.
It's one thing to read about it in a textbook. It's
Mhm.
another to see it play out in real life.
Definitely. And then there's the whole issue of Article 356, which is the one that lets the president impose direct rule on a state.
President's rule, right? That's a big one.
It is. And there have been plenty of times when governors have recommended imposing president's rule without what a lot of people saw as a legitimate reason,
All right.
like the Uttarakhand case in 2016.
Oh, yeah, that one's controversial.
It was. President's rule was recommended right before a vote that would have decided whether the government had majority support.
So it looks a lot like political maneuvering.
Right. And these examples just highlight how sensitive the governor's role is. They're like this crucial link between the center and the states.
And when that link gets strained, the whole system can feel it.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance.
Hmm.
And then beyond these big dramatic interventions, there's also the issue of governors getting too involved in the day-to-day running of a state.
So like meddling in things they shouldn't be?
Yeah. We've seen cases where governors have started poking their noses into routine administrative matters, sometimes even going against what the elected state government has decided.
Which obviously creates a lot of friction.
For sure. And it can even lead to things grinding to a halt because nobody knows who's actually in charge.
So it's like a power struggle within the state itself.
Exactly. The situation in Delhi in 2023 was a good example. There was a big fight over who controlled the administrative services.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And then there was the West Bengal case the same year where the governor decided to appoint vice chancellors for the state universities all on his own.
Wow. Unilaterally.
Yep.
And it caused a huge backlash. A lot of people saw it as a clear overreach of his authority.
It sounds like these governors were really testing the limits.
They were. And for UPSC aspirants, these are great examples to study because they show how these theoretical ideas about federalism can get messy in practice.
Yeah, the real world is never as neat and tidy as a textbook. Okay, so we've talked about the problems. What about solutions? Have there been any concrete proposals for how to fix this whole governor situation?
There have been. And a lot of them have come from committees that were set up specifically to study the governor's role and suggest improvements, like the Sarkaria Commission back in 1988.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
It was. They had a whole bunch of recommendations. One of the main ones was that governors shouldn't have a bunch of powers that aren't directly related to their core constitutional duties.
So keeping them focused on their main job.
Right. They also said that the chief minister of the state should have a real say in who gets appointed as governor.
So it's not just a decision made in Delhi. Exactly. And they suggested that people who are still very active in politics shouldn't be considered for governor positions.
So no partisan hacks, basically.
Oh, right. The idea is to have someone who's more neutral and impartial. And they also recommended limiting the governor's role in how universities are run.
So giving more autonomy to the states in that area.
Yep. These Sarkaria Commission recommendations are important for UPSC prep because they provide historical context for this ongoing debate about the governor's role.
It shows that these concerns have been around for a while.
Definitely. And then you have the Punchy Commission, which released its report in 2010.
What were their big ideas?
They were really focused on making sure governors don't just sit on bills forever. They recommended setting a firm deadline of 6 months for a governor to make a decision on a bill that's been sent to the president.
So no more kicking the can down the road.
Right. And they also wanted to put stricter rules in place to prevent Article 356 from being abused.
So making it harder to impose president's rule.
Exactly. They were adamant that it should only be used as an absolute last resort.
Makes sense. And what about the Venkatakalia Commission? Didn't they have some ideas about how governors should be appointed?
Yeah, they did. They wanted a more formal process involving a committee with people like the Prime Minister, the Home Minister, the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, and importantly, the Chief Minister of the state.
So a more collaborative approach.
Exactly. The goal was to make sure everyone had a voice and to reduce the impression that the central government was just handpicking governors it liked.
So more transparency and buy-in from the states.
Right. So those are some of the big recommendations. But what about actual concrete measures that could be implemented to prevent these conflicts between governors and state governments?
Yeah, what can we actually do to make this whole system work better?
Well, one big idea that came from the Punchy Commission is to create a formal process for impeaching governors at the state level.
So right now the president can remove a governor, but there's no way for the state to hold them accountable directly.
Exactly. And a state-level impeachment process would give the legislature more power to check the governor's actions.
Makes sense. And didn't the Supreme Court weigh in on this whole removal thing too?
Yeah, in the BP Singhal case in 2010, the court said that there have to be valid and legitimate reasons for removing a governor. It can't be done arbitrarily.
So there's a legal safeguard against just firing a governor you don't like.
Exactly. It's about making sure the process is fair and transparent. And there's also been talk about amending Article 163 of the Constitution.
The one about the governor's discretionary powers.
Yep. The idea is to tighten up the language and make it super clear when those powers can be used.
So limiting those gray areas where governors might be tempted to overstep.
Right. The goal is to ensure those powers are only used in truly exceptional circumstances where national interests or the Constitution are at stake.
So not just for meddling in everyday state affairs.
Exactly. And to make sure governors are actually being held accountable, there's the idea of having regular reviews of their conduct by independent judicial commissions.
So basically a checkup to make sure they're not going rogue.
Yeah. This would provide an objective assessment of how they're using their powers and whether they're staying within the bounds of the Constitution.
Sounds like a good way to keep them on their toes.
It would definitely add another layer of transparency. And finally, on the whole president's rule issue, we really need stricter guidelines for when Article 356 can be invoked.
So making it harder to just slap president's rule on a state whenever you feel like it.
Exactly. The S.R. Baumai case back in 1994 was a big step in the right direction because it said the courts can review a governor's recommendation for president's rule.
So it's not just a rubber stamp anymore.
Nope. And the Sarkaria Commission also said that Article 356 should only be used as a last resort when absolutely everything else has failed.
So it's like the nuclear option.
Exactly. For anyone studying for the UPSC exams, understanding how this debate around Article 356 has evolved, including these key judgments and recommendations, is super important.
It's a great example of how our legal system is constantly grappling with these complex questions about power and balance.
Absolutely. So to wrap things up, this Supreme Court ruling on the Tamil Nadu case, it's a pretty big deal.
It feels like a pretty strong statement about how our federal system is supposed to work.
It is. It reaffirms that governors are supposed to be guided by the elected government, and it puts those clear deadlines in place for how they handle bills.
So it's all about making the system more predictable and preventing unnecessary delays.
Exactly. And for all our UPSC listeners out there, think about the long-term implications of this. How will this ruling actually play out in state legislatures? What will it mean for the relationship between the central government and the states? What other reforms might we need to make things run even smoother?
These are the kinds of questions that can really deepen your understanding of Indian polity.
And they're super relevant for both your mains and prelims exams.
Totally. All right, folks, so that's our deep dive into this fascinating case.
Thanks for sticking with us.
If you found this breakdown helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on future episodes.
And drop a comment below with any questions you have or any other topics you'd like us to tackle in future deep dives.
Oh, and don't forget to check out the Indian Express for their in-depth reporting on this case. That's where we got a lot of our information from. All right, thanks for joining us.
See you next time.